that givers must learn to set limits because takers have none. Yeah, you heard me. That might be you. Givers have to learn to set limits because takers have none. And so when we talk about emotional abuse, this really is the scene for a giver and how they can fall into this world of emotional abuse. Today, I want to talk about something that a lot of people may not want to have a conversation about, and that is understanding matters related to domestic violence or family violence. Now, a lot of times when you hear discussions about it, we're talking about physical abuse. We're talking about challenges of simple battery and aggravated assault and things of that regard. And these types of abuse, where there's physical, where someone is putting their hands on one person or have threatened or injured another person, we're very familiar with these forms of violence. This is the domestic violence that many people are familiar with. But there's another type of family violence that would not necessarily cause you to end up in court. This is a type of violence that I call a silent type of family violence. And this is associated with emotional abuse. Yes, emotional abuse is a form of violence. And so when we think about a month like October, which is typically typically domestic violence month, I just want to pause and say and make the argument that every month is a month that we should pause to have a conversation about that which is one of the primary destroyers of the family, and that's family violence. It's critical too, because what happens that we do as adults will carry on to our children, and then our children end up having these types of trauma. So today I'm going to talk about emotional abuse, the hidden violence that has occurred. And I want to provide some definitions of what family violence is, or from the emotional abuse standpoint. I want to talk about how emotional abuse can impact someone. And I even want to talk about, whether or not you may be engaged in this type of behavior. So these are some tough conversations, but I think that they're conversations that need to be had. There was a time that family violence was viewed as a family matter, so therefore it was nothing that the police would respond to. Believe it or not, historically speaking, there was a time that a man could discipline. I'm using the word discipline. There was a time that a man could discipline his wife and his child with a rod as long as it was not thicker than the width of his thumb. So if you ever want to know where the term "it's a rule of thumb" comes from, it was associated with that rule of being able to discipline your wife and your child with a rod as long as it was not as thick as that thumb. And so that's physical. But emotional is something a little different. Now, when I talk about emotional abuse, there are many organizations and scholars who provide some fundamental definitions, because you need to understand this when I began to talk about how it shows up in family. So, for example, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, they say emotional abuse involves anything, behaviors that can create a type of harm in an individual, affecting their self-worth, their emotional well-being. And this may show up in the form of name calling or shaming or rejection, or even making some of the threats. And then there are other organizations. So the American Psychological Association, they make the similar argument. However, they focus on the psychological trauma, right? None of these involve putting your hands on someone. So these are including creating a sense of anxiety in an individual, chronic depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder that come for someone who has been really involved in this form of family violence over a period of time. Psychology Today, they even make an argument that they define this emotional abuse as anything, right? That can include verbal abuse, constant criticism, intimidation, manipulation, and refusal to ever be pleased. Now, I'm going to ask you all to put a mark here about this concept of this refusal to ever be pleased, because I need you to think about something. And this is a rule of thumb, and you all may have heard this before. So I'm going to give this warning as I move forward. And the argument is simple this, that givers must learn to set limits because takers have none. Yeah, you heard me. That might be you. Givers have to learn to set limits because takers have none. And so when we talk about emotional abuse, this really is the scene for a giver and how they can fall into this world of emotional abuse. So you heard those terms. So why must we focus on it? Because of the challenge of that if you are in a relationship where you have this constant intimidation, constant name calling, constant criticism, constant belittling of an individual, what begins to happen is you internalize it. And what do I mean by that? That means somewhere within your psyche, you begin to accept this form of communication. Now, I'm talking about families. I'm talking about something that can destroy a family and have multi-generational implications. So what happens if someone is constantly emotionally abused? How does it manifest up in that individual? So here, I'm going to tell you to get out your pen and paper. I'm going to ask you to now wrestle with this checklist and ask yourself if you are in an unhealthy relationship where this type of verbal communication occurs, then do this checklist so you can assess whether this is you. So number one, we see that someone who internalizes emotional abuse, they began to have low self-esteem, right? So now you began to develop this negative self-image of yourself, believing that you're worthless or unlovable, or even the concept because of all the criticism, you began to buy in and to accept it, and it accepts your self-esteem, how you began to see yourself, or whether or not you even have the ability to have an appreciation for yourself. Also, those who give into this type of internalized emotional abuse, they began to accept something called self-blame. That means they immediately take ownership of the behavior that someone else has done, right? So we've heard this kind of conversation, and you've seen it on some of my other podcasts when I talk about the wrong way to be wrong. And when you look at the wrong way to be wrong, when someone says, I never would have done this if you had not done that. Well, someone who has given into emotional abuse and they began to internalize it, then they began to make statements like this. Well, he never would have done this if I would not have said that. Or I knew that he had a bad day and he told me that when he's having a bad day to leave him alone, and I didn't leave him alone. And because of that, he said this. These are signs that you may have internalized this type of emotional abuse. And then the anxiety and the hypervigilant. This is an individual, and you all listen to this. This is an individual it reaches a point where now they're on eggshells. They want to get it right. They are constantly on edge. They're anticipating future curse outs, future name calling. So they start trying to do things to prevent a behavior like this from occurring. And then, of course, they reach the point where they internalize these negative beliefs. They began to reach the point where they are now believing that this is their own belief. Now they're accepting it, right? It's impacted their self-worth and their identity in that regard because they have internalized it. Now, keep in mind, I don't want you all to lose where I am right now. I'm talking about this emotional abuse, right? There are no physical signs that show up, right? The police, there's no case that someone can show up and a police or a warrant can be taken out in this regard because it's very small, it's very incremental, it's very verbal, it's very impactful on our level of emotions. Those who internalize it, they also, here we go, focus on people-pleasing behavior. This is why I said at the beginning that givers need to set limits because takers have none. When you've internalized this type of emotional abuse, then you begin to believe that there's something that you can do to make this person happy. Now, let me tell you this. If that person is not happy with himself or herself, there's nothing that you can do to make them happy. But if you've internalized this type of emotional abuse, then you get yourself on that Ferris wheel believing that you're going to keep trying to make that person happy. These are the people when they lash out, I've done everything I can to please you. And the question is, if they can't please themselves, then how and why do you try to please them? Over time, there are some manifestations of this emotional abuse that does show up. So when we began to talk about the chronic stress and health issues that began to manifest in those who've internalized this type of emotional abuse. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about manifesting, I'm talking about headaches, chronic back pain, other types of health conditions that began to occur, even acne showing up from the stress, loss of hair. All these things can be associated with emotional abuse, something that has occurred constantly and consistently throughout your life. So we talked about how you can internalize emotional abuse, but now I want to have a conversation with those of you who may be engaged in that behavior. Now this here, I'm going to tell you, put your seatbelt on, because this one may be a little uncomfortable to hear. I remember some time ago I talked about a true friend is going to try to be honest with you, right? They're going to try to have these upfront conversations with you. And I remember I told you all in some of my previous podcasts that 85% of the people in your life got your best interests at heart. It's only about 10% of the people in your life who probably have their own best interests at heart, and that's why they're involved with you. And about 5% of the people in your life don't have your best interests at all. But when you start treating the 85% of the people in your life the same way you treat the 10 or the 5% of the people in your life, then we have a problem. I'm saying that because I want to be honest with you all, and I'm going to ask you to take this inventory. Don't hang up. Don't disconnect. Don't change the subject. Don't switch to another podcast. I need you to listen to this. So number one, because you may be engaged in this behavior, so I'm going to run through these. Now, there is an added piece I want to give. Some people are completely aware that they're engaged in the behavior that I'm about to talk about. And some people, until they have this conversation, may not realize that they've been engaged in this behavior. So are you an emotionally abusive person? Here we go. Number one, constant criticism and belittling. If you find yourself in a relationship where you're constantly criticizing someone, belittling them for everything that they do, and you begin to wear down on their sense of self-esteem, that's something to consider. Also, isolation from family and friends. The way you talk with someone or engage with them, and now all of a sudden you have issues. And these are the type of statements. Every time we get into an argument, you call your mom and your sister. I walk in, we have an argument, you're on the phone with your mom and sister. Keep them people out of our business. Well, on the one hand, it does make sense. But what I do also understand that for those who are engaged in emotional abuse, they can gain power by isolating you from your family members. And so we have to pay attention to that. Now, this may have been the relationship that you had long before you met this person. You may have talked with your mom, your sister, your brother all along, but now all of a sudden, this person has an issue with you having conversations with your family members. You may be engaged in that type of form of emotional abuse. And then, of course, there's always what you see in both physical violence as well as emotional abuse. You see the manipulation and the control, right? Using these as a tactic to control the person's actions, their decision makings, and making them feel powerless. You know what you're doing. You have done this probably in previous relationships. And so we look at how manipulation and control shows up. What does that look like? Y'all got in an argument, she want to leave. You've hid her keys. Now you're looking at her. I don't know where your keys are. Or now she can't find the purse. I don't know where your purse is. Maybe you put it somewhere. You know what you did. Those who are conscious of this type of behavior, they engage in it. And they see it and they understand the impact that it has on that person. There's also gaslighting. You all hang in. I need you all to write these down. I need you to share these points with your family and your friends. I need you all to have these type of family conversations. The next time you and that person you care a great deal about, I need you all to sit down and say, let's watch the Dr. White show. Let's look at this podcast on emotional abuse, and let's examine whether or not we're talking to each other this way. So gaslighting is another form of emotional abuse that takes place, right? Making the person doubt their own reality, making them think that they're crazy. Your deliberate misinformation and denial of the truth. Here's one of the common concepts or terms I hear when I hear someone say, I've never been caught cheating. Listen to that. We've been together. I ain't never been caught cheating. And then people celebrate that. But when you pause the camera for a moment and listen to what he or she is saying, she's saying or he's saying that I've never been caught. And so the mind game that began to play and show out, and this can be very hurtful in that regard. Blame and guilt is another form. Y'all write these down. Blame and guilt becomes another form of emotional abuse if you're engaging in it, right? You constantly blame the person for all the issues and challenges that you have. You come home from work and you had a bad day, you mad as hell at your boss, and then you come into the home and now everybody in the house is having a good time, everything's going well. You come into the house and then all of a sudden you demand everybody to calm the hell down because you had a bad day, and you've automatically changed the entire energy and spirit of the house. And then you're saying, when I come home, I need about 10 minutes to wind down. You know that, but y'all don't wind y'all ass down. You see that? Well, that can also be a form where you're blaming the person and you're making them feel guilty. But then there's other forms of emotional abuse that are a little bit more frightening, right? So intimidation and threats. Now, a person who has internalized it, or if you're engaged in this particular behavior, you know that the person who is doing their best to try to please you, you know that they can't predict you. You know that you're giving that type of look. As a matter of fact, you even said, she know when I get that look to leave me alone. Now, think about that for a second, because that's what we do with our kids. With our children, they know we snap our finger, we give that look, and automatically they fall into order. But there's something wrong if you're applying that same tactic to your spouse. Then we know that that is a tactic of emotional abuse that you are engaged in. And of course, there's humiliation and degradation, right? So if I'm in a public setting, and if I had a fear that if we get into a conflict, then what's going to end up happening is that you're going to show out in public. Then I'm going to agree with you just for the sake of agreeing with you, because I don't want you to show out in public. And if I can't predict whether or not you show out in public or not, so guess what I'm going to do by default? I'm going to agree with you, because your unpredictable reactions keep me on eggshells. And if you're conscious of the fact that your reactions and your behavior are unpredictable, then we are falling into a situation that becomes even more problematic. Listen, for some of you, the way you all talk to each other, you didn't start this relationship that way. That very first relationship, that very first date that you all went on, you didn't say, hey, you stupid MF, what do you want to eat? And she said, I don't know, you dumb MM. That's not what happened on the very first date. Because if that would have happened, the relationship, there never would have been a second date. But somebody introduced that language. I call it the emotional vocabulary. Someone introduced that language into the relationship, and somehow with the introduction of that language into the relationship, you buy into it, it somehow becomes acceptable, and then you become what I refer to as numb to the language and the assaults. And this is what I need you all to understand. When I hear someone tell me, yeah, he talked crazy, yeah, she talked crazy as hell, but it go one in and in the ear and out the other. Well, what you're telling me is that in actuality, you've internalized it. Because emotional assaults should never go through one ear and out the other. It should make you feel some type of way. But if it has become part of your defense mechanism, that someone makes these statements and then you believe or behave as if it has no effect on you, the truth is it has. You've internalized it and you've accepted it. Again, emotional abuse is not something that's going to show up in scars. But I will tell you this, the tongue is far more dangerous than the gun, because the tongue will have multiple generation implications. That means your children have witnessed how you've talked to one another, and then when they become of age, then you have taught them how to handle conflicts. And for you brothers, I want to say this. When you make statements about how she is, and you tell me that this is to be without you or to manage finances or anything without you, she wouldn't know what the hell she's doing. But if I ask you, how old is she? And you tell me she's 25, and you tell me that y'all been in the relationship for 5 years, then my argument is going to be, well, 20 years before she met you, she was able to handle this. And then all of a sudden, in the 5 years with you, she's incapable of doing it. It may not be her, it may be you. I know this is a heavy conversation. I know it's an uncomfortable conversation, but I'm going to ask each and every one of you to have a family meeting, to sit down, to have a conversation about how we talk to each other. And I can almost bet that if you really think about it, you don't like the way you talk to each other. So I want you to be intentional on how you communicate with each other. I want you to sit down. I want you to go through each one of these bullet points. And I want you to ask yourself and ask your partner, is that me? I'm Dr. Gary O. White, and this is my truth.